All right, I have brought onto the screen with me Caren Neal, who is our speaker this afternoon. And I'd like to introduce her and tell you a little bit about her. Caren S. Neal is a PhD and MFA and has taught storytelling studies at Florida Atlantic University since 2001. She's a Fulbright senior specialist, and she's performed and lectured in 6 countries and 10 states. She's published 5 books, including Only in Florida and Florida Lore, both through the History Press, and appears weekly as a co-host of the South Florida public radio segment, The Public Storyteller. Stories performed this afternoon are based on Dr. Neal's book, Florida Lore. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Caren S. Neal and turn our program over to her.
Not a creature was stirring, not a bird was chirping, not an insect wing was whirring. The swamp that became known as the Everglades was completely silent. The 2 brothers, who were known as the best hunters in their tribe, who never came home without something for the tribe to eat, they were astonished. Nothing like this had ever happened before. As they made their way hour after hour, they didn't see anything alive. They didn't hear anything. They put their ears to the ground. They smelled. They didn't get anything whatsoever. And after 4 or 5 hours of this, the sun began to set. They were disgusted, but they could not return to camp without bringing something for supper. So they found an abandoned old tree trunk. They climbed in and they fell asleep. Well, apparently, sometime in the night, it must have rained tremendously. It must have been coming down in sheets and torrents, because when the younger brother woke up and stepped out of that tree trunk, made his way onto the ground, it was completely wet. It was soggy, sodden. His feet were making these spongy sounds and feeling as he was walking more and more, looking around himself. But then he came upon a couple of bass that were sort of hopping, sort of jumping in the wet grass. And that's when he felt the pains in his stomach. He felt so hungry, he knew exactly what to do. He somehow managed to gather a couple of dry twigs and managed to find a place where there was a rock that he could just sort of dry off. And because he had a lot of experience, he was able to set a small fire. He stuck one of those fish through a twig and then the other, and he began to cook the fish for breakfast. Well, while he was thinking about this delectable, delicious meal, he felt a tapping on his shoulder, and he looked back, and it was his older brother. His brother said, "What are you doing? What do you think you're doing?" "What do you mean, what am I doing? Can't you see what I'm doing? I found fish. Aren't you hungry?" "I don't know. That fish doesn't really look very good. First of all, it looks too big. Second, it looks too fat. Third, there's something weird about, and it's kind of glowing. Next, you're going to say it's too delicious. If you don't want any fish, I'll have it myself." And with that, the younger brother finished cooking the fish, ate it right off the stick, and then he licked every finger. I'm a professional, by the way, folks, so I have washed my hands before this show. Don't worry. licked every finger. And the other brother said, well, you ready to go? Absolutely. So they went on their way, continuing to find something for the tribe they knew was very hungry at this point. Well, as they walked, the younger brother started scratching. He felt really itchy and really dry. And then, as they walked a little further, he began to fall further and further behind his elder brother. And when he looked down to see what the problem was, he noticed his legs were beginning to fuse together. Don't you hate when that happens? At one point, he couldn't go any further and he began to fall over and he called out to his brother. His brother turned around. He said, I don't know what's going on. I think I'm turning into a snake. I don't know. Run back to camp. Get the tribe. Get the family. Get everybody. Run back before it's too late. Well, the elder brother ran as fast as he could. Instead of 4 hours, it took him maybe an hour and a half. He gathered the people, the chief and everybody he could, and then his parents, and they ran back. By the time they got back, the younger brother had morphed into a 30-foot long snake that was wide and brown and very, very unhuman-like. When they gathered around him, and all that was familiar was his terrified brown eyes, the younger brother said, "This is what happens when you forget the traditions of your people. Our mother told us never eat anything that isn't familiar to you, and that's what I forgot. And look what happened to me. Be sure that you do not abandon our traditions." And with that, the snake, the younger brother, began to circle around on himself. And he went faster and faster and faster and faster and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And then the rains began to come. And before you knew it, that hole that his body dug was half an acre in size. And as he was finishing up whirring around, he shot off and disappeared. And it is said among the Seminole people that the furrow that followed his body, that is the Kissimmee River. And that big hole that filled with water, that is Lake Okeechobee. And ladies and gentlemen, that story is absolutely true. Now I say true with my tongue firmly planted in my cheek. What do I mean by absolutely true? What I mean is the following. This book, which you just heard about, Florida Lore, which by the way is available at the Historical Society. This book is about Florida lore. And that's what my presentation is to you today. What is lore? Very simply, it's the cultural products of a society, folklore. So a cultural product may be a dance, it may be a food, it may be clothing, it may be a basket, it may be a narrative. What I just told you was a story, a myth, that has circulated for many, many years among the Seminole people. Do they believe in it literally? I'm going to suggest to you that, as with the legends that I'm going to tell you today, that may be the wrong question to ask. Whether they believe documentably, verifiably, hands on a stack of holy books to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, whether they believe that this actually occurred is not the point. The reason I collected Florida lore is because we learn just as much, if not more, about our neighbors, about our society, by learning about the myths and the tales and the legends that are told among us. So what I collected was not history. I collected takes on history. I collected things that we may know absolutely positively are not going to stand up in any good journalistic enterprise, or historical, but they resonate. We feel them. They make an impression on us. We remember them. And this story, I don't know if any of you have heard it before, but this story has been told time and time again throughout Florida, and certainly throughout South Florida where I live. But I'm not going to tell you stories of South Florida today. I'm going to tell you stories of Southwest Florida. And the next story that I have for you is a legend. Now, a myth that I just told you, kind of a myth and kind of a, just calling the Seminole, just call it a story. That is a sacred tale that helps us understand how things came to be. A legend is based in some way on fact. Nobody is going to say, no geologist to know, nobody is going to say that Lake Okeechobee and the Kissimmee River were developed because of a snake, a boy who turned into a snake. But there may have been, probably not, but there may have been a person like the people in some of these legends. And more importantly, the place definitely existed. So a legend is either the person existed, like George Washington, or the place existed, like Tampa, that I'm going to be discussing in a minute, and Fort Myers, or the incident really happened. So for example, there may be legends of the Civil War. The things may not have actually happened, but the Civil War we know happened. So why do people tell these legends? Again, it's because facts, history, we're talking at a historical society, history, these are absolutely critical to our understanding of what has happened in the past and how the world works. I am suggesting, again, as I say, that these things that are not quite factual also have a place. The important thing is that somebody doesn't say this is what actually happened. Somebody explains what we're telling. And so I am telling today lore. And as you will see, some of the names are familiar, certainly the places are familiar, but whether the stories actually happen like they happen, I am not a historian and I don't intend to be. You can then go to the Historical Society and find out for sure. And here is my next story. Jose Gaspar stood on the bow of the ship. He had never felt that clench of desperation in his chest in all his 65 years. He knew he was beat as he took the anchor chain and began to wind it around his body. Never did anybody think he would end up like this. In 1756, when he was born, it was to a very aristocratic family near Seville in Spain. And the Gaspars treated their little boy like he was a prince. In fact, all children of noble families were given a big allowance at that time. By the time he was 12, he had his share, but it wasn't enough. So he hit on a plan, because he was already a bit of a rapscallion, a bit of a rascal. He hit on a plan. He invited over to his house a pretty blonde 12-year-old girl for lunch. And at the end of the lunch, he wouldn't let her go. He sent one of the servants back to her parents with a note saying, I must have 100 gold pieces to release your daughter. Now, not so cleverly, he had also put his name and address in there, so it wasn't the greatest kidnapping plan. But the parents were so flummoxed beyond that. They were so horrified that they contacted his parents right away, and there was a huge to do. It turned out that the magistrate of the area gave Jose and his parents one decision to make. Should the 12-year-old go to a military academy or should he go to prison? Well, you can imagine what his parents decided. And as his mother hugged him goodbye, she said, "Oh, Gasparilla," because that's what she would call him, Gasparilla, little Gaspar, try to be good, try to be a good boy, try to behave yourself. He shrugged her off. Nobody expected that this child would amount to anything. But he excelled at the Naval Academy. In fact, he not only graduated with honors, but he was then, after graduation, promoted till he became naval attaché to the king. He was pretty proud of himself and his power and his good looks, and he had more than one paramour until he married and had a child. Now, you would think with a good job, with a good family, with the king's ear, which he had, you would think all would be well. But Gaspar was still the rascallion he ever was. And he decided that he was not happy with just one woman. So what did he do? He went after this one and that one and this one and that one until he found himself one night at the king's ball dancing with a woman he had been with for off and on for months and between others. And she leaned over, whispered in his ear, "Let's run away from here. I don't care about my husband. You don't care about your wife. Let's go out, go off." "What are you talking about? Let's go off. Let's go off together and start a new life." "I wouldn't do that. Well, I would be bored to tears with you. Are you kidding? I would never want to do that. You're crazy." And with that, he left her on the dance floor. Ladies, can you imagine such a thing? Well, not only was she well placed in society, but she was related by marriage to the king. And so, very quickly, the king decided that Jose Gaspar had to be chained up and thrown into prison. Well, he was having none of that. And his family was able to bribe the guards. He got off in no time and he escaped on a sailing ship. All was well for a while. And he was doing pretty well and pretty happy until he decided that he wanted more. He wanted more power. And he didn't like the fact that the captain was going very far inland, very far into the sea, very far a sea, in order to avoid the British and the Spanish fighting. So he induced the crew to mutiny. And when they had thrown the captain overboard, he decided that he was going to rechristen the ship the Gasparilla, the little Gaspar. He was going to rechristen himself Gasparilla. And the island that they stopped at in Charlotte Harbor, that was going to be Gasparilla too. For the next 40 years, Jose Gaspar and his merry band of men wrought havoc in that area with ships going through to Cuba. All would have been bad enough, but he had a very strong mean streak about women. He decided that whatever ship they found, wherever there were women involved, they would pull them off and bring them to an island that he named Captiva for the captive women on that island. But he also had, beyond this cruelty, he also had a bit of gallantry as well. And he decided that he was going to be very, very kind to the next woman he met. And indeed, he was. He fell in love at age 65. This was after many, many years. He fell in love with a beautiful, beautiful young woman, and he decided that she was going to be his consort. But when he asked her to marry him, this Giuseppa said, I can't do that. I'm sorry, I can't do that. I can't marry you. I can't be yours. I am promised to somebody else. Please leave me be. He was so angry that he slit her throat. But Gasparilla was not the man he had been the last 40 years. He was 65 years of age, and this last downturn just really hit him. He never recovered from Giuseppa. He did name an island, a small island after her, but he decided it was time to retire. He had $30 million in gold set aside. He set some to New York. He put some others, he hid in some islands up the coast. He was going to leave. He told his crew, and they had one last drink together. And as they were saying their farewell, somebody spotted a ship, one more ship, a British, it looked like a British merchant ship. And he thought, as they do in the best detective shows, one last hurrah. You know, you always know people are in trouble when they say, I want one last hurrah before I retire. So the ship did what it usually did. It got itself between the wind and the other ship, and that's when the merchant vessel released the British colors and brought up the flagpole, the United States colors. It was the USS Enterprise, and they had a cannon. And that cannon, before Gaspar and his men knew what was happening, had shot their own vessel, and the Gasparilla was beginning to sink into the water. It was at that moment that Gasparilla ran to the bow of his ship, took up the anchor chain. He wrapped it around himself. He said, no one is going to kill me. Gasparilla will die by his own hand. And he jumped overboard with his sword in his hand. It is said to this day that as long as you don't stand in the bow of a ship in those waters alone, you might be safe. But if you do, the ghost of Gasparilla will pull you down to his level. Now, I will tell you, because we have a historian in the room, at least one, and many history lovers, I will tell you that historians not only doubt that Jose Gaspar ever lived from 1756 to 1821, but they also say that that area really didn't have a lot of pirate traffic either. So I don't know how much we can trust this particular story, but what does it tell us about the way people think about this area? How did that story get started? Well, people think that around 1900, there was a yarn spinner who brought it together. And then there was an advertisement that also kind of played on that. And that it was such a great story. People love ghost stories. I may just tell you another one, that it became part of the lore of the area. Is it fun? I would bet that you would say yes. Is it memorable? I would bet that the next time you go to a Gasparilla festival, the last weekend of January, I will bet that you will remember a little bit of what they're trying to recreate when they kidnap the mayor. And so these things take on a life of their own. Again, never am I saying this is history, but it is a part of our, let's say, cultural currency of the area. So if people go to a Gasparilla Festival, oh, I know the story. Yeah, I know the story. It connects us not only to other people, but to place. And we know now more than ever, when we are, many of us, stuck in our homes, we miss the places we used to go to. We miss our own neighborhood, many of us, and we really need to connect with others as well as we can. This is a way that we have done that for centuries. In the case of the last story, the myth I told you, we've done it for 6,000 years, perhaps, because that's how old they estimate Lake Okeechobee is. So the next story I'm going to tell you is something that also may be familiar. I wanted to tell you stories mostly that were connected to the place you're in. And this one begins in Fort Ogden, not very far away from you at all, maybe about an hour's drive, I believe. It begins in Fort Ogden. And the way it starts is with a splash. James Acrefoot Johnson heard the alligators, one after another, enter the water before he saw them. There's a first for everything. And in his years as a barefoot mailman, he had not yet gone into waters where there were alligators. Now, what were the barefoot mailmen? Actually, they weren't called this at any time in history. They were often called walkists. These were people who participated in a program, a United States Postal Service program that began in 1845. And it was all over the country in places where there weren't railroads and where there often weren't roads at all. Where I am on the southeast coast of Florida, our most favorite and famous walkist or barefoot mailman is a man named James Mitchell. And he supposedly drowned when his skiff that he was using to get across the water was stolen, because they had to go very often 70 miles, 75 miles each way, or 60 miles. And there were waterways in between. So they always hit a skiff in the brush. And sometimes, I'll bet you it was Northerners. I can say that because I'm a Northerner. Sometimes, and they think it might have been, people came along and they borrowed the skiff to go to the other side of the water without returning it. And so when the mail service carrier came along, he was not able, and it was always a he was not able to get across the water. Well, it was 1877. And good old James Johnson, his real name was James Mitchell Johnson, was living in Fort Ogden. He was 26 years old, newly married. I should tell you, he was a big old boy. He was about 6'7" or more in his stocking feet, and he had size 12 shoes. Now, when I do this performance live, I ask, and if there are any men in the audience who have size 12 shoes, to show them off so people have a visual for that. But I'm going to ask you to use your imagination. He weighed about 250 pounds, and he was strong, agile, energetic. So when he found the advertisement for somebody to take the new Fort Ogden to Fort Meade route, which through the non-existent roads was about 70, 75 miles north, he decided that right then and there, he was going to walk over there and volunteer. Now, the walkists, as they're called, did not have to carry leather sacks. They could bring canvas. They carried a cup. They carried a knife. They carried coffee. They carried hard biscuits. They carried matches. And oh yeah, the US mail. And he knew that he could do this job better than anyone else. Well, when he arrived at the Fort Meade post office, it was swarming with applicants. Little by little, they whittled the field. They were very interested in a 6'7" guy. And with those big feet, they whittled the field to two possibilities. Big Ed Donaldson, who was an Indian fighter, and James, they called him Acrefoot because of those big feet, James Acrefoot Johnson. So when Big Ed said, well, I can do this in a week, I can take the mail back and forth, no problem in a week, they were all ready to give the job to him. Acrefoot said, well, I can do the job twice in a week and maybe 3 times if the weather's good. There was nothing for it but to have a race. So the 2 men set out from Fort Meade south to Fort Ogden. At first, they were neck and neck or foot and foot. And then little by little by little, Acrefoot pulled ahead. And he pulled so far ahead that he got back to Fort Ogden. They had a party. They had the drinks ready for him. There was a big celebration. He was so far ahead that he picked up the fiddle and played while they danced. And then he picked up the mail as well and started on his way back. Well, he got a little stone in his shoe or something, so he sat down for a minute to pull it out. And who comes along but Big Ed Donaldson? Donaldson says, I knew that I'd catch up with you. I'm going to beat you while you're sitting there. And Acrefoot says, well, you almost did, except I'm going back home the way we started. He got the job and he did great. There are so many stories of how he outwalked a horse and how he did all kinds of amazing feats of speed. But he was also a brave guy, this Acrefoot. One time he got to the edge of a waterway, and it was one of those times when the skiff was gone. Somebody had taken it across and he was left wondering what to do. These waterways were filled with gators, and it wasn't a great thing for him to contemplate. Well, just then, as he's thinking what he's going to do, somebody runs up to him he hadn't noticed before. The man says, oh, I'm so glad. You see that sailboat over there? And he looks and he sees a boat way out in the distance. He says, that boat, I got to get on it, but I'm afraid I can't swim. Can you swim over to that boat and get them to bring me back? Well, Acrefoot is thinking. And as he's thinking, the man says, I'll give you 5 gold pieces. Acrefoot's thinking. The man said, okay, 10. I'll give you 10 gold pieces. Well, Acrefoot puts down the mail and he begins to swim. Now, he was swimming not just for the man, he was swimming for the mail, because these routes were called star routes. There were 3 stars or asterisks in the register, in the US Postal Office register, for celerity, security, and certainty. You had to be fast, you had to keep the mail safe, and you had to be responsible. And Acrefoot was all those things. Well, as he began to swim, that's when he heard what I told you at the beginning of the story, the splish splash of pitter patter of little gator feet. He turned away and he saw for the first time a creature that was almost as fast as he was. He pulled out his knife, he stabbed the gator, and then he opened up those jaws and broke the jaw. And he made his way as quick as he could while the 2 other bull gators were chasing him to that sailboat, jumped on, and the boat took him back to shore. Well, when the man at shore heard his story, he said, my goodness, he's reaching into his pocket to get the money. He said, what some people will do for 10 gold pieces, 10 gold pieces, I would have done it for 5. That is Acrefoot Johnson. Now, Acrefoot Johnson did live, as far as we know, was a real person, James Mitchell Johnson. Whether or not these stories happen, we're not so sure. But what is the purpose of a legend? Besides connecting to people and place, a legend does something else very interesting, as all folklore does. It gives us some sort of idea of the values of our culture, in this case, Florida, the values of our society. This story lived, I'm going to suggest, because it taught celerity, security, and certainty. You hear a story like this and you think, wow, what a guy. It doesn't matter to you if the story didn't happen. You've got that image. Just like if you see Superman, just like if you see any fictional thing, art really does inspire. You may be not thinking consciously about being inspired, but it really does inspire us and tell us this is what our state values. You may not see that every day, but this is what our state valued enough for people to share these stories. Now, let's see, are there any questions? I would love people to give me some questions on chat while I'm telling you these stories. I will also give you an opportunity to raise your hand or ask questions at the end. And Patricia will curate this if I don't. You are welcome to ask questions toward the end. And then I will finally end with one last story. Well, the next story I thought I would tell you is actually, I'm going to read it to you. I've decided because I got a special request for it, and I want to be sure, because this part of the state is really, I know, just as we are in my part of the state, very interested in this guy. This comes from the book, the only story I'm going to read, The Life and Death of Ed Watson, an Everglades legend. Here's my little introduction first. The life and death of Edgar Bloody Watson, his nickname wasn't Acrefoot, Edgar Bloody Watson, were the raw material for 3 of Peter Matheson's novels, which the famed author reworked into the National Book Award winner Shadow Country, and for good reason. First off, there seems to be something about gentleman killers that excites our interest. Perhaps it's the odd juxtaposition of good manners with bad behavior. For another thing, the tale cuts a wide swath across the early 20th century South and West, from the Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma, to South Carolina, Arkansas, Texas, and of course, a chapter or 2 in Florida. And finally, the other reason why we're so interested in Ed Watson, Ed is an early example of a serial killer, a man who appeared to take murdering a human being as lightly as killing a fly, and did it considerably more often. And think of all the serial killer shows that are on Netflix at this very moment, half of which we probably all have watched. In his lifetime, Watson is believed to have murdered by stabbing or shooting in the neighborhood of, anybody want to take a guess? 50 men and women. And given his penchant for drowning his victims' bodies, we may never know for sure. 55-0. So here's the story, the way I retell it based on the sources I found. Quinn Bass, Sam Toland, Adolphus Santini, Belle Starr, Dutchie Melbourne, Hannah Smith, Leslie Cox. Was the dapper man with the red hair and blue eyes thinking of any of his victims when he maneuvered his gasoline-powered launch toward the dock at Ted Smallwood's store on Chokoloskee Island on October 24th, 1910? Like most locals traveling through the Everglades, he knew Ted carried the supplies he needed. Why, the double-barreled shotgun in his hull was loaded with gunpowder he'd bought from Mamie Smallwood last time he'd stopped by. As he drew the boat closer, the man looked in vain for his pal Ted among the crowd of 20 or so awaiting his approach. Instead, he saw angry faces, guns loaded. He tied down the boat and clambered up onto the dock. "Who killed him?" one of them cried out. "Who killed Cox?" "Fell into the water and drowned," he replied calmly. "What do you want with me?" "Give it up, Watson," another man called. "You're finished." He raised his gun, and they all raised theirs. It was the moment Ed Watson had expected all his life. Edgar J. Watson was not born in Florida. He was born in Edgefield County, South Carolina, in 1855. His father was a violent prison warden known as Ring Eye due to the knife scar encircling one eye. As a child, he and his mother, Minnie, lived in terror of his father and did everything they could not to raise his ire. He was planting peas in the garden not long after his 9th birthday when a neighbor called out to him, "Hey boy, where's your pa?" "Don't know, at work maybe." The man moved toward him along the darkly furrowed earth. "Better watch where you're throwing them peas, son," he said. "That's a mighty sloppy job you're doing." The child felt his heart begin to race, but he didn't say a word. Reaching into his pocket, he scanned the horizon. Not a soul was in sight. As the neighbor turned to leave, the little boy suddenly suddenly fell forward into the dirt, stabbed by a rusty penknife in the back. Afterward, Ed walked home for supper. His mother took one look at the knife sticking out of the pocket of her son's bloody overalls and began packing their bags. She didn't need to ask any questions. They caught the next train to Lake City, where she had family. That was in Florida, of course. Ed's cousins taught him how to dress, how to speak well, but they were older and tended to lord it over him. He wanted to be a man in charge, worthy of respect. So when he came of age, he married the first young girl who would take him. She was pregnant, and she couldn't easily afford to say no. One night, Ed and his cousins got to playing darts in a neighborhood bar, and the drinking and the ribbing got a little out of hand. He pulled out a .38 caliber and shot one of his kin in the head. His other family members were too stunned to move, but 3 strangers went to grab him. On his way to the door, he shot them too. For the second time in his young life, Ed Watson was on the run. The next few years saw him making his way through Arkansas and Texas and way out to Indian Territory, which I said was Oklahoma, sometimes in the company of outlaws like Belle and Max Starr. But the bandit queen, Belle Starr, tough as she was sickened by the young man's cruelty. She told him she had half a mind to turn him in for some of the stunts he pulled during their jobs, some of the killing he'd done just because he could. Not long afterward, she too was found dead, shot in the shoulder and the face, not 300 feet from Watson's cabin. Over the following years, Watson was accused of several more murders and assaults, sometimes over nothing more than being outbid at a land auction. Every time his attorneys managed to get him off. They argued circumstantial evidence, lack of credible witnesses, reasonable doubt. He soon learned how to play the US criminal justice system like a hand of poker. And then, in 1892, it looked as though Ed Watson were at last going straight. He purchased Chatham Bend Key, one of the famed 10,000 islands in the Everglades, for $250. 17 miles south of Chokoloskee, the 40-acre island was to be transformed in less than 2 decades into an agricultural empire. Watson became the most successful farmer in the Everglades, growing, processing, and distributing everything from winter vegetables and sugarcane to syrup and buttonwood. He built a 2-story frame house for his wife, this was his second, that aroused the envy of every visitor. The odd thing was his farmhands, mostly drifters from Punta Gorda and the Keys, kept disappearing. There was also word of his cutting the throat of a man named Adolphus Santini and paying $900 to settle the matter out of court. How much is a life worth? He didn't even know his victim, Quinn Bass. He met him in a fight in an Arcadia tavern and broke it up with his Smith & Wesson. Then The man who didn't want to sell him Lost Man's Key was discovered dead, along with his nephew. There were also Cox and Smith and Melbourne, all killed apparently at the same time. When a sheriff's deputy finally came calling to investigate some of these disappearances, Watson actually forced him at gunpoint to pick sugarcane and then return to the sheriff with a warning of his own. It was Hannah Smith's corpse, so large that a leg was exposed in the water, despite the weights placed inside, that sent the locals looking for other bodies in the vicinity. That's what led them to the showdown at Smallwood's store. As I said, it was October 24th, 1910. After a slight delay due to a disastrous hurricane, 24 local vigilantes waited for Ed Watson. He stepped out of the launch and raised his shotgun, but nothing happened. Perhaps because the gunpowder was wet from the storm, or perhaps, just perhaps, because Mamie Smallwood had intentionally sold him a bad product. In any case, he could not fire. The locals had no such problem. 33 shots went off, and Ed Watson's killing spree was over. Now, sometimes people ask me, before I see if they've got any questions, sometimes people ask me, well, how much do I make up? What is my version or variant, as folklorists call it? How is mine different from others that I saw? Well, different people work different ways. What I did, not as an academic, I just did this as an entertaining book. What I did was I took every version I could find and I kind of meshed them together and then used completely my own words. I like to start with a strong image and end with a strong image. So I turn things around a little bit to make it sound more like a story that you would like to listen to. But what folklorists would do in such a case is they would take every single version. I stopped at 3 or 4, whatever was locally available, until I felt saturation. I felt like I got the full story enough that I could make something out of it. What folklorists would do in an academic work is get every single thing they could find, and they would double check the sources to see, well, how many, if 8 versions or variants said it was 50 people he killed, and if 2 versions said it was 80, they would go with the 50. And they would, try to figure out, well, what do most people say? What do most people who do this work say? They would also connect it as best they could, which I did up to a point, with the history of the time. So if you're an oral historian and you interview somebody in World War II and they say such and such happened, you got to be sure that that war happened and that that battle happened that day. So they do a little more double, triple checking. I was looking for it to be fun. Excuse me. So let's see, do we have any questions here? I would love Seminole Chief Jim Billy's CD, Seminole Fire. It includes the legend of Kissimmee River and the snake. Yes, absolutely. It is wonderful. It is absolutely wonderful. And the rest are about audio. Any other questions or comments? Here I see a question. Is there folklore based upon the life of Toch Brown? Do you know? I haven't seen it. I don't know the way I did this book. I'm sure that it's available. The way I did this book was I started with as many Florida, it's available on Amazon. Thank you very much, Robert. Isn't chat great? I just love this platform. So the way that I did this was looked at people who were doing this kind of thing, and the stories I chose were the stories that were told most often. I'm telling them as folklorists often do. We don't reinvent the wheel. Certainly we don't, not that I'm a a professional folklorist, a professional storyteller. But what they do is they find what's around, and some people will find things that are less known. I was particularly looking, these books, this is published by History Press, and these books, I'm sure you have seen books that look like this. They are sold in museums and in gift shops, as well as this book was in my Walgreens, I noticed, and as well as Walmart and places like that. But they're sold to people who want to get not an academic look, but more, what are the popular legends? So this particular story did not show up in enough books so that I included it in mine. But maybe the next edition, maybe the sequel. Is there anything else up here? Or no, it's just that. I'll give you a minute if I see a hand raised, but I don't know how to get to that hand. Do you, Pat?
Let's see, I'm going to ask our technical expert, Heather.
Maybe maybe it wasn't there. Maybe it was just me that put it up by mistake, because I am not a technical expert. It may have been I who raised my hand by mistake and thought it was a raised hand. I think that's what it was. I got all excited. Somebody raised their hand. Anybody have any questions about storytelling, what it is to teach storytelling, what it is to be a professional storyteller? I don't work a lot with children. I work mostly with adults, a lot with older adults. Storytelling is used in so many fields. It's used in law. I've done presentations for the American Bar Association, not because we're teaching people how to lie, but because we're teaching people how to present the story of a case as well as possible. It's used in healthcare. It's used in peace and community building, which is a lot of the work I do. It's used in all kinds of areas that you wouldn't expect. So if nobody has another question, I will go to my last story. This story, but thank you for the questions I got. This story is a folk tale. The end of the book, I collect folk tales from a lot of the nationalities, the ethnicities that have settled in Florida, the most popular ones, because these are the people who are our neighbors, right? These are the people whose stories we need to know in order to know their values, in order to know what's in the back of their head and what constitutes their lore. So I included Japanese, and I included Jewish, and I included Cuban and some others, Haitian, etc. But the story I'm going to end with is a cracker folktale. And I'm sure most of you know that cracker is not a term of denigration. It refers quite specifically to a group that originated in Celtic areas around Wales and around the British Isles, and people who have been in Florida for maybe 5 or 6 families that have been in Florida rather for maybe 5, 6 generations. It is not a derogatory term the way it is properly used, and some people think it should not be used. Where did the term come from? There are a lot of theories. It might have to do with cracking the whip. We had a great storyteller, Butch Harrison, who called himself the last cracker storyteller, and he would show whip cracking that was used a lot in cow country. It may also be from the word crake, the Old English word crake, which means to kibitz, to make tell stories, to be a yarn spinner, etc. And they were great at that. So here's the story, The Education of Epaminondas. Epaminondas was a little boy, and he loved his mother. So when his mother told him to take her freshly baked chocolate cake to his grandmother, he said, "Yes, mother." And he walked to his grandmother. His mother said, "Wait, wait, wait, be very, very careful. Make sure you don't drop it. Hold it carefully." "Yes, mother." So he held the cake very, very carefully against his chest. By the time he got to his grandmother, the cake was in tatters. It was all crumbs. His grandma said, "Oh, Epaminondas, you foolish boy. The next time you have something like that, put it on your head. Now, Epaminondas loved his granny. Yes, granny. And he went home. The following week, Epaminondas's mother said, I've got some freshly churned butter. I'd like you to bring it to granny. Now, Epaminondas remembered what granny had said. So he put the butter on his head and he walked through the Florida heat. And by the time he got to granny, it was all over his face. She said, Epaminondas, you foolish boy, the next time you have something like that, dunk a couple of palm leaves in the stream, and when they're nice and cool, wrap it around and carry it. Yes, Granny, he was a good boy. He loved his granny. He was going to be much more careful. So he went back home, and the following week, his mother said, Epaminondas, our puppies are ready to give out, and Granny wants one. Will you bring one of the newborn puppies to Granny? Well, Epaminondas remembered what Granny had said. So he took a couple of palm fronds and he dipped them in water and he very, very carefully wrapped the puppy in it and carried the puppy to Granny. And by the time he got to Granny's, no puppy. Granny said, Epaminondas, you foolish boy. Don't you know the next time you have something like that, put a rope around it and drag it behind you? Yes, Granny. Well, the following week, Epaminondas' mother said, I'm giving you one more chance. I have baked bread and I want you to bring a loaf to Granny. Yes, mother. He was a very good boy. So he remembered what Granny had said and he wrapped the rope around the loaf of bread. He dragged it to Granny. And by the time he got there, it was gone and a mess all over the road. Well, Epaminondas' granny said, forget it. You're too foolish. Don't bring me anything else. I think his mother was a little foolish to ask him that between you and me, but don't bring me anything else. Well, his mother agreed. And the next week, she decided that when she baked 6 cherry pies, she would bring one to her mother when it cooled. So she set the cherry pies 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the steps leading up to the house. She said, Epaminondas, I'm just going to the market. If you have to leave the house, be very, very careful how you step. Now, Epaminondas was a very good boy and he loved his mama. So, yes, mama. Well, she was gone not 15 minutes. When he wanted to go outside, he opened the door and very carefully he put a foot in each of those 6 pies. And suffice it to say, Epaminondas was never heard from again. Florida lore. Thank you so much, everybody.
Oh, Caren, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. We just have a couple of remaining questions, which we will take a look at and get to you so that you can answer them for us. But we do want to thank you so very much. You know, the Historical Society is working hard, as so many historical societies are, to bring quality programming and in this case, wonderful stories to our members and our supporters and our donors. And it's just been a pleasure, a real pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. So thank you very much. And for those of you that are still with us, we are the Marco Island Historical Society. Our mission is to preserve and share the history and heritage of Marco Island and the surrounding community. If you'd like to learn more about us, please do visit our website at the MIHS.org. You'll find out lots of great information about the society and also about the wonderful museum that we're a part of. So thank you and have a great afternoon.